BioShock is an institution in video games for its storytelling and groundbreaking gameplay. Between the worlds of Rapture and Columbia, we play through stories of cities rising and falling in spectacular fashions and maybe casually learn some morals along the way. Ever since BioShock Infinite though, it's been a little hard to get a hold on what exactly happens when, especially after Burial at Sea. Fear not though, we're going to go through all of it right now. I found that the best way to explain the continuity of BioShock is not to explain it all as one timeline, because if you've ever looked at a graph or picture version of the timeline, it's a mess thanks to non-linearity. However, if we explain the continuity as 3 separate timelines, or 3 separate sets of timelines in the case of Columbia, it all starts to make sense. These 3 timelines are the Rapture timeline, the Columbia timelines, and the Burial at Sea timeline. All 3 of these combine to make the complete continuity of BioShock. Now, a fair warning. This might end up being confusing thanks to multi-universe and time travel shenanigans, but I'm gonna try and explain these as best as I can in the most linear fashion possible for everyone's sanity, yours and mine included. As a point of reference, the things we're using for source material here are the BioShock games themselves, all the story DLCs, the companion novel BioShock Rapture, the alternate reality game There's Something in the Sea, the novella BioShock Mind and Revolt, and interviews pertaining to BioShock games and statements Ken Levine has made in reference to canon on Twitter and other sites, because of course those are a thing. If something isn't immediately referenced by gameplay, I'll put it in the bottom right if it's from a non-game source such as Ken Levine's Twitter or the ARG. There's quite a bit of stuff that's divulged in interviews and articles, so be sure to check the link to all the sources if something leaves you scratching your head. Lastly, be warned that due to the novel being a lower canon than the games, and Burial at Sea Part 2 heavily retconning a lot of things in the BioShock and Columbia timelines, intentional or otherwise, there's going to be a few conflicts in canon. I'll explain these conflicts as they come up to the best of my ability. In the early 20th century, a young Andrei Rainovsky flees the Bolshevik Revolution with his mother by train. His father is cut and executed before his eyes as they depart Belarus to eventually make it to the United States. In spite of this tragedy, Andrei Americanizes his name to Andrew Ryan and amasses a spectacular business empire headquartered in New York City. His wealth and eccentric mannerisms lead him to be compared to the likes of Howard Hughes and the robber barons of the late 19th century. Among his many acts, he is known for strikebreaking, being a vehement opponent of the New Deal, and even going as far as to burn down a forest he privately purchased when he learned that it was going to be nationalized to make it a public park. Meanwhile, Brigitte Tenenbaum, a 16-year-old Jewish girl with high-functioning autism, is captured by the Nazis and sent to a concentration camp. She makes a name for herself as a scientific prodigy, being called Das Wunderkind, a name given to her by the scientists at Auschwitz because despite of having no training whatsoever, she is a spectacular geneticist. She is allowed to study under Joseph Mengele. Tenenbaum scoffs at the Nazi notion of eugenics though, and finds that their obsession with aesthetics and looking a certain way is a waste of time. At the end of World War II in Europe, Tenenbaum vanishes, believed to be a part of Operation Paperclip, but in truth went somewhere far more secretive. Around the same time, in another part of New York City, a confidence man currently using the identity Frank Gorland is running a bar and attempting to grift money out of the mob through fixing boxing matches. His true name is unknown as he frequently changes identities, drawing from an upbringing with a traveling vaudeville show. He fools a federal investigator into divulging that Andrew Ryan is being investigated for something big, but no one knows exactly what he's doing over in the docks. Gorland intimidates a dock worker into divulging Ryan's secrets and learns of Ryan's grand scheme. Frank Gorland kills one Frank Fontaine in order to assume his identity so that he can use Fontaine's fishing company to get close to whatever Ryan is doing. In August of 1945, Andrew Ryan receives images of the atomic bombs being dropped on Japan through his own informants in the US government. Shocked by the destruction seen in the images and dead set that the world was going to come to an end soon thanks to atomic war, he greenlit the Rapture project, a plan to create a massive city under the seas in a remote part of the Atlantic Ocean situated between Greenland and Iceland, where Ryan would recruit the best and the brightest in the world to live in a city with no laws but the free market, where all would be unrestricted in their pursuit of greatness. Building Rapture at the bottom of the sea was a challenge. Not only did Andrew Ryan have to assemble a web of shell companies to mask the purchasing of large amounts of raw materials in order to construct buildings, but thousands of workers were needed not only to construct the city, but also to be trusted not to tell a single soul about what they were working on. The project initially started with a large submersible platform called the Sinker, lowering down raw materials to allow for foundations to be built on the ocean floor. Unfortunately, past the foundations of Rapture is where the first major conflict in canon occurs. According to the novel, BioShock Rapture, giant domes were built out of a special alloy called rhyanium, which let the workers construct the first few buildings and major sections of the city before eventually being disassembled so that the rest can be built from the already complete buildings. However, Burial at Sea Part 2 says that Rapture's surface scrapers were built prefabricated on the surface with aluminum frames that could be used to submerge them and then lower the buildings all the way down to the seafloor. Neither is more practical than the other, since the domes seem like they would just get in the way of making buildings after a certain point, even after disassembly, and by the book's admission, thousands of workers died, beating out the death toll of the Panama Canal construction within a month of Rapture's construction starting. However, the burial at sea method is also impractical, as the nearest land where structures could be built is over 200 miles away from Rapture's site, a very long way to tow something the size of a skyscraper. If you want the nearest land that's far away from any cities where anyone might see what you're doing, you're going to have to go nearly 350 miles away from Rapture's location. I'm going to have to side with the burial at sea method for this one, because while both methods have their issues, BioShock Rapture is a companion book, whereas Burial at Sea is story DLC, making it a higher level of canon. Meanwhile, Frank Gorland, now posing as Frank Fontaine, begins doing business with Ryan Industries, supplying fish to feed the Rapture workforce through Fontaine Fisheries, and sending letters to Ryan himself praising his ideologies and entrepreneurial spirit. The flattery works, and where initially no invitation was planned, the man claiming to be Frank Fontaine is invited to join the great people who will populate Rapture, being part of the first wave to do so. The man claiming to be Frank Fontaine brings his longtime second-in-command Reggie, as well as Fontaine Fisheries' first mate Peach Wilkins, although this does seem to conflict with an audio diary in BioShock 1 where Peach talks about joining Fontaine already in Rapture. As Rapture began to approach completion, Andrew Ryan began to send his invitations to those he thought were worthy of the Rapture experiment and who would keep the secret of the city. He in turn liquidated his own assets on the surface and began to cut all unnecessary business ties, going as far as to leave unneeded raw materials rotting on boats and harbors from vendors like Orrin Oscar Lutwidge, who was perplexed as to what happened with their deal with Ryan, as well as what happened to Andrew Ryan himself. Starting in 1946, invitations to Rapture were accepted, and people began to notice the sudden disappearance of many of the foremost leaders in the arts, sciences, and business. In addition to Andrew Ryan, his head of security Sullivan, his general contractor and World War II veteran Bill McDonough, and several employees who had worked close to him all had disappeared without a trace. Great minds such as geneticist Bridget Tenenbaum, Dr. Yi Suchong, the Australian engineer Keebers, and renowned botanist Julie Langford had all vanished without a trace shortly after the end of World War II. Other disappearances of note included the brothers Wales, famous architects known for their Art Deco style, Sandra Cohen, a Renaissance person of the arts who, while once great, was considered by critics and theatergoers to be well past his prime, Dr. J.S. Steinman, perhaps the greatest plastic surgeon in the world, industrialist Austin Sinclair, mathematician and associate to Alan Turing, Charles Milton Porter, along with prolific engineer Reed Wall, and many, many more. The current world powers that be paid little attention to this event, assuming that anyone who had disappeared had likely either defected to the US or the USSR and had changed their identities in order to ensure that they weren't found. Some people, however, had different ideas and would call this phenomenon the vanishing. Theories range from pilgrimages to mystical cities in the mountains to mass abduction by the Soviet Union. Oren Oscar Lutledge believed that Andrew Ryan was at the center of this vanishing and would form the International Order of the Pawns, a secret society devoted to finding where Ryan had gone with all of these people. As more people arrived to the city of Rapture, things seemed to be going very well at first for Andrew Ryan's grand experiment. Business boomed, scientific breakthroughs were made. Sandra Cohen did some really weird, questionable stuff, all according to plan. While things were going well for the most part, one day Bridget Tenenbaum was walking in Neptune's Bounty when she noticed a dockworker who had once had a crippled hand playing catch with the hand that was supposedly crippled. When asked about the hand, the sailor told Tenenbaum that a sea slug had bit him and the hand had just healed. Upon examining the sea slug, Tenenbaum discovered that it contained a genetic material called Adam, which alters cells, living or dead, into STEM versions of themselves, and such cells could be overwritten to have spectacular powers. Initially, Tenenbaum was unable to find any sort of funding or even support for this scientific endeavor, and eventually resorted to striking a deal with a man calling himself Frank Fontaine, who was very keen on what could become of this Adam. Fair warning, as the next bit of information comes from the novel BioShock Rapture, which is a lower form of canon than the rest of the games. On top of being able to use Adam to rewrite the human genome to make a person the best that they could possibly be by natural standards, it was discovered that supernatural phenomena such as telekinesis, spontaneous combustion, and saints being able to manipulate bees to live on them without doing any harm, along with many others, were not just tall tales, but actually very rare genetic quirks that could be harnessed with Adam. There were even theories by Dr. Yi Suchong that Adam could be used to genetically enhance an unborn child to facilitate them growing to adulthood in a miraculously short period of time. These plasmids took the city of Rapture by storm. As was the way with Rapture, no regulations of any kind were put into place on the new and booming genetic market. While there were stories of Adam having terrible side effects after prolonged use and talk of splicers, Adam addicts who had become disfigured beyond the point of being human from extended plasmid use, Rapture for the most part was fine, and the presence of Adam was in the city without causing too much harm. There were, however, issues with smuggling and racketeering. One of the very few laws in Rapture was that nothing was allowed to come in or out of the city. No raw materials, no trade goods, no communications of any kind. Nothing. This didn't stop the citizens of Rapture from wanting these things though, and there quickly became a black market for anything from the surface for those who desperately wanted to know what was going on in their absence. Things such as religious memorabilia often fell into the realm of confiscation, as well as movies, beef, letters from family members, and other comforts of the surface world that were not able to be reproduced at the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, the cutthroat nature of Rapture was beginning to take its toll on some, and crimes of passion were on the rise. While some theorized it might be the lack of natural sunlight, others thought that the isolation of Rapture was beginning to get to people. Ryan begrudgingly brought down Dr. Sophia Lamb into the secret city of Rapture and hoped that her psychiatric expertise might be enough to ease the nerves of his citizens. Meanwhile, much to Ryan's dismay, his one-time admirer and now full-time rival Frank Fontaine was beginning to start philanthropic endeavors, such as Fontaine's Home for the Poor and the Little Sisters Orphanage. Ryan especially did not like this because he felt it went completely against the spirit of Rapture's philosophy. Ryan's plan with Lamb begins to backfire though, as Sophia Lamb was beginning to form a cult of personality around herself and was quickly becoming a more popular figure in Rapture than Ryan himself. After a few botched debates suggested by his chief of engineering, McDonough, Ryan eventually had an operative newsman, Stanley Poole, infiltrate her collective in Dionysus Park and collect enough information about Lamb to have her imprisoned in Persephone, a secret prison built by Augustus Sinclair for Ryan's political dissidents. To make matters worse, a lone diver had inexplicably found his way to Rapture with no outside help, and this Johnny Topside, as he was called, only ignited tensions further as it compromised the Rapture secret. In an attempt to bring order to his city and remove another one of his enemies, Ryan amasses enough evidence to authorize a raid on Frank Fontaine's business operations for running a smuggling ring, and has Sullivan round up a small army to take him down. Unbeknownst to Ryan, Fontaine caught wind of this plot and enacted a plan of his own. He had Dr. J.S. Steinman perform Adam-enhanced plastic surgery on himself to entirely alter his his own appearance, while also having the same be done to his second-in-command, Reggie. Reggie is altered to be a perfect duplicate of Frank Fontaine's previous appearance and assumes control of all of Fontaine's operations. When the raid happens, it's Reggie that is killed in a shootout rather than the man who once called himself Frank Fontaine, and shortly after the raid on Fontaine Fisheries, a mysterious figure named Atlas shows up in Rapture, helping the poor and disenfranchised, where Fontaine had once done so, much to the ire of Andrew Ryan. While Fontaine is allegedly dead, another plan he had in the event of things turning on him is put into motion. Fontaine had commissioned Bridget Tenenbaum and Dr. Yi-Su Chong to create him an atom-enhanced human with mental conditioning in addition to spectacular physical attributes that he would be able to totally control with certain phrases. In order to ensure that this atom-enhanced human would have no issue infiltrating Ryan's security systems, which were now coded to Ryan's own genetic sequence, however not very precise, Fontaine bribed exotic dancer and paramour to Andrew Ryan, Jasmine Jolene, to become impregnated by Ryan, and then allow for Tenenbaum and Suchong to take and grow the child with Adam for Fontaine's purposes. Ryan eventually learns of Jasmine's betrayal, but it's too late, and by the time he confronts her, the child, named Jack, had been sent to the surface to await activation. Ryan had bigger issues though. Proliferated use of Adam led not only to the rise in the amount of splicers, but also a shortage of Adam. Ryan, who had nationalized Fontaine's business holdings after the raid, much to the wide outrage of pretty much everyone in the city, fast-tracks the Little Sister program, something Fontaine Futuristics had been working on to help with the shortage of Adam, but had initially been looked over by Ryan Industries. It was discovered that when bonded to the digestive tract of a young human host, Adam slugs produced an exponential amount of raw Adam to be used for splicing and plasmids. There was a problem though. Crazed splicers were attacking these so-called Little Sisters in order to forcibly remove the slug and take the Adam for themselves. Ryan had Dr. Suchong develop the Protector program, which created the Big Daddy, a man that was heavily altered for the use of surgery, Adam, and put into a heavy-duty protective suit to be bonded with the Little Sisters for their safety. These first Big Daddies, the Alpha series, consisted of Ryan's political prisoners, such as the infamous Johnny Topside and disgraced programmer Charles Milton Porter, who was actually framed by colleague Reed Wall through the use of Rapture's computer AI, the Thinker. Before his arrest though, Porter initiates a protocol in the Thinker for it to find a way to get out of Rapture. The Big Daddies came just in time. On the eve of the new year in 1958, a party at the Kashmir restaurant was raided by a group of rebels that were led by none other than the elusive Atlas. Lucky for Ryan, he decided not to attend and instead worked through the night. Depending on which source of media you reference, these rebels either came from the slums in Apollo Square or from the Fontaine department store, both of which were converted into prisons, and the latter of which was supposedly dropped down a trench near the bottom of Rapture. On top of the rebellion, word came through that Inner Persephone was now under the control of one-time prisoner Sophia Lamb, and that she had been seen operating in Rapture proper. The people of Rapture flocked to both sides of the conflict in order to support Atlas or Ryan, and on top of a physical arms race, a genetic arms race began. Adam and plasmids were being produced as fast as they could, with a rapid expansion of the Little Sister and Protector programs to keep up with production needs. Atlas's rebels regularly attacked Big Daddies in order to get the Adam for themselves, where they could not purchase it from Ryan, leading to the streets of Rapture becoming a very unsafe place and new, more powerful models of the Big Daddy being produced. Rapture was quickly falling into ruin, and in the midst of this war, Orrin Oscar Lutwidge, one-time supplier of Ryan who had since dedicated his life to finding Rapture, found his way into the secret city and was shocked by what he saw. While he briefly participated in the Civil War, including the use of Adam for his own safety, he eventually fled Rapture, making him the only person other than Jack to successfully infiltrate and escape the city. However, the effects of Adam and the story he told led him to become eventually committed to a mental hospital, but not before changing the dedication of his life from finding Rapture to making sure that no one ever found it again. A solution eventually came to Ryan for the war in the form of an Adam-enhanced pheromone produced by Dr. Suchong, which was able to control the splicers, splicers, which were now most of the population. This allowed Ryan to have nearly every user of Adam wrapped around his finger. Atlas's forces were reduced to the few who chose not to splice during the war, making his rebellion effectively over. Ryan was in control of his city again, but there was not much left of it. Many parts had been badly damaged by the Civil War, and even with the extra Big Daddies doing heavy maintenance on the city, it wasn't enough to stop some parts of the city from being reclaimed by the ocean. In the end, Ryan lost most of his business interests in the war, his own right hands, one being Security Chief Sullivan, who had chosen to end his own life after being racked with guilt for performing a politically motivated assassination of a musician on behalf of Sandra Cohen, and Bill McDonough, who had tried to assassinate Ryan himself, but ultimately failed. Ryan still had his city, however. Atlas was still somewhat active, but there was very little he could do with the few people he had left. Lucky for him, a small airplane inexplicably crashed exactly on top of the site of Rapture, with one person even surviving and making it down to the city. This unlucky stranger, a man named Jack, is thrust straight into the chaos that is Rapture, but comes into contact with Atlas through a shortwave radio in a bathysphere that he arrives in Rapture with. Jack is forced to take Adam and splice his own genes in order to survive his first few minutes in the rapidly sinking city. Andrew Ryan initially accuses Jack of being an agent of one of the world's superpowers, and uses his pheromones to sick the splicers on him. Jack escapes to the medical pavilion and hopes that he can meet up with Atlas and Neptune's bounty, but a lockdown forces him to confront and kill a now completely insane Dr. J.S. Steinman. Meanwhile, a side effect of plasmid use begins to manifest in Jack, where he begins to see the ghosts of people in Rapture, thanks to bits of their genetic memory being left over in recycled Adam from Little Sisters. Jack uses Steinman's genetic key to disable the lockdown and travel by bathysphere to Neptune's bounty, where before he can make it to Atlas's hideout, his path is blocked by Peach Wilkins, who tasks him with using a special camera to gather information on spider splicers, a kind of Adam addict that uses large hooks to crawl on walls and ceilings. Jack complies and even agrees to hand over the weapons he's found in Rapture so far upon entry to Wilkins' hideout, but is nonetheless attacked by Wilkins and his cohorts. Lucky for Jack, he is now considerably more spliced than he was before and can defeat Wilkins and his crew on plasmids alone. Jack makes it to Atlas's hideout, only to have Ryan use the splicers again to attack and destroy the bathysphere that allegedly held Moira and Patrick, Atlas's wife and child. Distraught, Atlas tells Jack to go to Arcadia so they can regroup and retaliate against Ryan. Things quickly turn sour in Arcadia though, as Ryan releases a chemical defoliator that kills all the trees in the park, effectively cutting off the city's oxygen supply. To make matters worse, Ryan gasses Dr. Julie Langford in her laboratory before she can synthesize a cure called the Lazarus Vector, a chemical cocktail that can bring dead plant matter back to life. Jack and Atlas are able to find the recipe for the vector in her lab, and they fight their way across the cultist-infested park and through the adjacent farmers market to gather the ingredients for the Lazarus Vector and disperse it through Arcadia. After leaving a now stable and oxygen-producing Arcadia, Jack is briefly trapped by Sandra Cohen in Fort Frolic, where he is forced to complete a deranged art piece for Cohen that involves killing his former disciples. While Jack is in Fort Frolic, he sees more Adam ghosts, including an apparition of one Jasmine Jolene, Ryan's former paramour. After finishing Cohen's murder quad tick, Jack is allowed to go to the Hephaestus Core, where Ryan is hiding out. Ryan is secured in a heavily fortified office. However, Jack is able to finish making an EMP bomb that was initially started by Keybers, one of Ryan's senior engineers. The bomb goes off, leaving Ryan defenseless, but not before Ryan activates a self-destruct sequence for the entire city. Jack confronts Ryan, where he reveals that Jack has been under the mind control of Atlas this whole time, before using Jack's command phrase, "Would you kindly," to have Jack kill him. Upon overriding the self-destruct sequence, it is revealed that Atlas is actually the man that once claimed to be Frank Fontaine, who has been using Jack to not only take over all of Rapture's systems, but also to kill off anyone that might complicate his plans. Jack is rescued by a group of Little Sisters who take him to Bridget Tenenbaum's lab. Tenenbaum, who has been urging Jack to spare the Little Sisters, admits her role in Jack's creation and partially undoes Jack's mental conditioning while he was unconscious. The man claiming to be Frank Fontaine uses other command phrases to cripple Jack, but Jack is eventually able to secure a dose of Lot 192, a treatment for mental conditioning made by Dr. Suchong by commission of Fontaine in the event that someone tried to use the mental conditioning on him. After obtaining a couple doses of this Slot 192, Jack is completely free from Fontaine's control on him and is able to pursue him. Jack chases the man claiming to be Frank Fontaine to Port Prometheus, where it is revealed that Fontaine has started tapping into his own massive supply of Adam for personal use before jamming a door to his sanctum. Jack is forced to undergo the procedure to become a Big Daddy in order to use a special entryway meant only for little sisters and their protectors. Jack confronts Fontaine to find out that he has now infused himself with an obscene amount of Adam and uses a little sister's syringe to drain it of him before Fontaine is overcome by a group of little sisters, killing him with their syringes. Jack and Tenenbaum use a bathysphere to take the rescued little sisters to the surface, where they all live happily ever after. With both Andrew Ryan and the man who claimed to be Frank Fontaine out of the picture, Sophia Lamb was able to take power in the ensuing vacuum, and her Rapture family proliferates across the entire city, claiming it for themselves. Sophia Lamb learns of Jack and sees him as a perfect utopian, since his mind conditioning made him completely unable to act selfishly, and he could be used to further the greater good without fear of self-preservation getting in the way. Sophia Lamb initially tries to recreate a perfect utopian by attempting to infuse a person with very large amounts of recycled Adam that has passed through Rapture's greatest minds and thus gaining their genetic memories on top of the powers Adam could grant. Her first experiment with this, on her follower Gilbert Alexander, fails horribly, leaving Alexander a deranged sea monster that was impossible to control. Upon learning that little sisters who came to adulthood processing Adam were far less susceptible to the negative effects of plasmid use, she began to try this process on her own daughter, Eleanor, who had once been a little sister before Sophia Lamb rescued her, right before the Civil War broke out. However, there was an issue with the lack of enough Adam to try this experiment again, and nowhere near enough little sisters to produce what Rapture family needs. Sophia Lamb recruits girls like her own daughter, who were little sisters as a child, to capture young girls from the surface in order to make a new generation of little sisters so that they could produce the Adam they needed. These Big Sisters, as they were called, were incredibly powerful splicers, whose modified Big Daddy suits allowed them to operate nearly anywhere and overcome almost all obstacles to capturing new little sisters for the Rapture family and protecting them from attackers should their assigned Big Daddy fail. Some people began to take notice that the vanishing seemed to be happening again nearly 10 years after it had stopped. One man in particular, Mark Meltzer, would begin investigating something in the sea and track all the disappearances that seemed to specifically target only young girls now. He was initially unimpeded in his investigations and was even able to get some outside help from former members of the International Order of Pawns before the Big Sister that was abducting girls from the surface chose to abduct Meltzer's own daughter, Cindy, in retaliation for his investigations. This only increased Meltzer's determination to find where all these girls were being taken to, and he eventually fakes a mental breakdown to be admitted to the same facility that the Order of the Pawns' former leader, Orrin Oscar Lutwidge, was being held. Meltzer convinces Lutwidge that he is worth trusting about Rapture and is given the Rubik's Cube, one of the puzzles Lutwidge had designed before he went into the construction materials business. Meltzer eventually finds Rapture and begins to explore what's left of the city, leaving behind audio diaries because video game. But he is ultimately captured by Sophia Lamb's family, and Meltzer is given a choice between death and conversion into a Big Daddy. Meltzer decides that if it means he can be with his daughter and protect her, the permanent conversion into a Big Daddy was a fate better than death. Fearful of what her mother's utopian project might do to her, Eleanor Lamb calls upon the new little sisters to take her former protector and Alpha Series Big Daddy codenamed Subject Delta to a Vita chamber and rework it to accept his DNA so that Delta can come and rescue her. Being an Alpha Series, Subject Delta has a much stronger bond to Eleanor than the mass production's Big Daddies did to their own little sisters, and is physically hurt by his distance from Eleanor, so he is forced to act quickly. Delta is contacted by Bridget Tenenbaum, who has taken it upon herself to return to Rapture and rescue the kidnapped girls from life as a little sister. Delta aids Tenenbaum in escaping Rapture with a number of rescued girls, and Tenenbaum puts him into contact with former industrialist Augustus Sinclair. Delta and Sinclair begin to fight their way through what's left of Rapture, acquiring plasmids and dealing with heavily mutated splicers, who have now had 10 years of splicing to mutate far beyond human form to horrifying results. Delta and Sinclair are eventually confronted by Lamb's senior followers, the first of which is Grace Holloway, a jazz singer, governor of Pauper's Drop under Lamb's regime, and Eleanor Lamb's former caretaker while Sophia Lamb was in prison. Delta deals with Grace before continuing on the Rapture metro system, but the train Sinclair and Delta are using is torpedoed by Simon Wales, one of Rapture's architect and devout follower of Sophia Lamb. Delta is forced to kill Wales as he is far too gone from Adam to be saved. Once Wales is dealt with, Delta reverses the pump controls in Siren Alley to allow for the drainage of Dionysus Park in order to find a new Rapture Metro car. There, Delta and Sinclair meet Stanley Poole, journalist and former operative of Andrew Ryan. Poole reveals to Delta that he was once the infamous Johnny Topside who had inexplicably discovered Rapture all on his own, and asked Delta to help him retrieve all the genetic memory from Little Sisters in Dionysus Park. After dealing with the Little Sisters, who have now absorbed the genetic memory of Lamb's former followers, Sophia Lamb reveals over the intercom that it was Stanley Poole that had betrayed her, flooding Dionysus Park and killing a large portion of her flock, as well as it was Poole who sold out Johnny Topside to Andrew Ryan, which caused him to be converted into an Alpha Series Big Daddy in the first place. The player deals with Stanley Poole through Delta and continues to Fontaine Futuristics. There, Sinclair and Delta are confronted by Lamb's previous utopian experiment, Gilbert Alexander, who has left behind audio diaries from when he wasn't a monster, instructing anyone who finds him on how to wrest the controls of Fontaine Futuristics from his current self, and pleading with whomever finds the audio diaries to please kill him in his current state. Delta fights against splicers subbed by Alexander, now calling himself Alex the Great, including several of the Alpha Series Big Daddies like himself. Delta overcomes the obstacles put in place by Alex the Great and captures him in an underground laboratory, where he takes a sample of Alexander's genetic material in order to reverse engineer a genetic key to Persephone prison complex where Sophia Lamb is headquartered and keeping Eleanor. The player chooses how to deal with Alexander in his current state before entering Persephone through a dummy oxyfill station just outside of Fontaine Futuristics. Delta enters Persephone and fends off not one but two big sisters before nearly rescuing Eleanor, but before he can make it to her chamber, Sophia Lamb smothers Eleanor with a pillow, which causes Delta to collapse as a result of his protector conditioning, while Delta is rendered comatose by Eleanor's heart briefly stopping. When Eleanor is resuscitated, Delta comes to and is no longer bound by the protective conditioning. Delta is restrained in a holding facility, but again, the Little Sisters bound to Eleanor come to his rescue via a special plasmid that allows him to see through their eyes and control them as Eleanor has done. The player sees the world through the warped vision of a little sister and is confronted with the choices they have made as subject Delta throughout the game. Delta, through the Little Sisters, collects pieces of a set of Big Sister armor for Eleanor, and when she dons it, she rescues Delta. Unfortunately, Sophia Lamb has also captured Augustus Sinclair while they were freeing Delta, and has converted him into an Alpha Series Big Daddy with a modified version of Jack's mental conditioning. Sinclair is forced to confront Delta as Delta tries to escape Rapture. Subject Delta and Eleanor rescue all the Little Sisters held in Persephone and use their powers to boil off the ballast water in a craft that could carry them out of Rapture. Disheartened by her daughter's betrayal and the failure of her plans, Sophia Lamb activates a sequence that will jettison all of Persephone into a trench that it hangs over rather than see Eleanor escape to the surface. Delta manages to hold off the last of Sophia Lamb's forces while Eleanor and the Little Sisters ready the escape craft. But just before Delta and Eleanor can board the craft, a large amount of explosive placed by Lamb or her followers goes off in the access tunnel, and while Eleanor is able to teleport away from the blast, Delta is caught in it, but manages to cling to the hull of the escape craft as it rockets to the surface. Depending on the player's choices through the actions of Subject Delta, Eleanor Lamb will either choose to rescue her mother or watch her drown in the craft as it heads to the surface. Eleanor then absorbs Delta's atom and genetic memory so that she can have them to guide her through the surface world, but the player can choose to have Delta stop her from doing so for whatever reason. Sometime later, Bridget Tenenbaum finds a way to make contact with who she thinks is Charles Milton Porter, who is allegedly hiding in Rapture Central Computing, the place where an analog AI, the Thinker, is kept, and where all automated functions from door controls to oxygen flow and security systems are regulated. Porter revives Subject Sigma, another Alpha Series who was previously trying to infiltrate Rapture Central Computing, before Reed Wall, now heavily spliced and obsessed with working out what he calls the equation to all things, detonates explosives in the hallway he was traveling through, thus incapacitating Sigma. Sigma comes to and is is able to enter Rapture Central Computing and makes his way through spliced programmers to confront Reed Wall, but not before Wall warns him that he might not like what the Thinker has to say when he accesses it. Upon accessing the Thinker's mainframe, the Thinker confirms Sigma's identity, revealing him to be actually Charles Milton Porter, who had been arrested by Ryan after being framed as a political dissident through Wall's use of the Thinker, and that in the process of attempting to compute a way out of Rapture as Porter had instructed it to before getting arrested, the Thinker assumed the identity of Charles Milton Porter to convince Tenenbaum to come to Rapture Central Computing to rescue Porter and the Thinker. Once they all escape after defeating Wall, Tenenbaum, Porter, and the Thinker devise a way to reverse the effects of atom sickness and is reverted back to a mostly normal human being from being an Alpha Series Big Daddy. Very few people have managed to visit Rapture and live to tell the tale. Across all sources, those that made it out of Rapture alive are Jack, Bridget Tenenbaum, the first generation of Little Sisters, including Sally from Burial at Sea, Orrin Oscar Lutwidge, Charles Milton Porter, Eleanor Lamb, the second generation of Little Sisters, Elaine and Sophie McDonough, Bill McDonough's wife and daughter respectively, but this is only confirmed through the book, and depending on the actions of the player through Subject Delta, Sophia Lamb may have also survived living in Rapture. The secret of Rapture couldn't stay hidden forever though, and eventually, at an undetermined time, evidence was discovered that lends credence to what was once thought to be the insane ramblings of Rapture survivors who chose to talk about what happened at the bottom of the ocean, particularly Lutwidge. As part of a promotion for Burial at Sea, a clip of a documentary that looks as if it was published in the late 80s was released that implies that Rapture's existence was accepted by the general public and that artifacts from the city have been found at various times. The effects of Rapture's existence on the present-day events of the universe that Rapture exists in, however, have yet to be seen. In the late 19th century, a man named Booker DeWitt participates in the Wounded Knee Massacre as part of the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army. He earns the name the White Injun of Wounded Knee for his brutality, which included the scalping of his victims among other atrocities. DeWitt left the Army as a hero among his peers, but deeply scarred by his actions done in the service. At some point, Booker DeWitt attends a riverside revival where a priest is offering baptism in the waters of a nearby river, offering to absolve all the sins of those who do so and make them born again as a new man in the eyes of God. This is where the crux of the timeline split. In one reality, Booker DeWitt refuses to believe that a dunk in the river can wash away all that he has done and leaves the revival without being baptized. In another reality, Booker accepts the baptism and is reborn as Zachary Hale Comstock. In the timeline where DeWitt now goes by Zachary Hale Comstock, he amasses a following and forms the Church of the Prophet, a cult that alleges that the founding fathers of the United States were holy figures and that Comstock would lead his followers into a utopia in the sky where they might escape the current state of the United States, referred to as the Sodom below. Meanwhile, a physicist named Rosalind Lutece discovers a means to affect the state of an object in a quantum field, which allows it to levitate with little to no additional help. With additional research, Rosalind learns how to communicate across realities through what is called the Lutece field, making contact with her alternate self, Robert Lutece. Upon meeting Lutece, Comstock agrees to help her with funding by using the considerable tithes he receives from his followers. When presented with the findings, Comstock uses these tears from the Lutece field to look into alternate realities, believing them to be windows into the future rather than the alternate realities that they are. This greatly bolsters his status as a prophet to his following. Sometime in between the events of Comstock's baptism and the founding of Columbia, he marries one Annabelle Watson, who would later go on to be Lady Comstock. Comstock soon gains an even larger following than he had previously been able to and convinces the US government to fund the building of Columbia for the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Now, according to Booker DeWitt's Pinkerton's contract, which states his date of birth, this would have made Comstock 20 years old when Columbia was unveiled to the world. And since I've opened Pandora's box here, I might as well elaborate. None of the dates given in BioShock Infinite stand up to any sort of scrutiny whatsoever, and it's clear that the writers wanted their characters to be associated with certain historical events, but still be a certain age. Consequences be damned. Take Booker DeWitt / Comstock's military service. Given the date of their birth in 1874, based on Booker's Pinkerton's contract, they would have been 16 years old during the Wounded Knee Massacre. But since Slate, who fought alongside DeWitt, there calls him Corporal, a rank that requires a minimum of 26 months service to reach. Booker would have been at oldest 14 when he joined the US Army. And while it wasn't unheard of in the 19th century to turn a blind eye to fit youths who wanted to serve, who were well below the age of 18, most of these accounts were about men aged 15 to 17. But according to the shadow box in DeWitt's office, Booker made staff sergeant before his discharge from the Army, honorable or otherwise. And according to the Army's website, you have to have served for at least 84 months, that's 7 years, in order to be considered for that rank, with an average promotion time from enlistment of about 8.5 years before you're considered for E6. And I'm ruling out battlefield promotions here because during the time of Booker's military service, aside from the Wounded Knee Massacre, which isn't really grounds for promotion, it was relative peacetime, meaning it's unlikely to be promoted in the middle of battle. If we assume that Booker DeWitt made staff sergeant on the day that he was eligible for it, which also just so happened to be the day that he was discharged from the military, which is also the day that he signed up with the Pinkertons, so the latest possible point he could have stayed in the Army, Booker DeWitt was 11 years old when he enlisted in the Army, a literal child soldier. Okay, now that I've gotten that off my chest and illustrated why you should absolutely not take any date seriously in the Columbia or Burial at Sea timelines, let's get back to the Chicago World's Fair. While the government was funding the Columbia project, Comstock still needed someone who would get the city built on time and within budget. Enter the brothers Fink. Particularly Jeremiah. Jeremiah Fink was integral to the construction of Columbia. Using his contacts in the prison system, Fink was able to procure near indentured servitude levels of cheap labor for the construction of Columbia in exchange for having the laborers' prison sentences commuted. The workforce that made Columbia was made up almost entirely of minorities and immigrants who had either been imprisoned, were down on their luck, or according to an interview in Mind and Revolt, just got drunk one day, blacked out, and ended up on the workforce. Through Fink's work in Lutece's science, Columbia was unveiled at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 before going on a world tour to show off American exceptionalism overseas. While in the city of Columbia, Comstock's powers only grew as he had now a captive audience and increased access to tears, which he used to give more prophetic declarations. Through the Lutece field, Comstock sees that his bloodline will need to continue for Columbia's success. However, the massive amounts of radiation from Lutece fields have not only rapidly aged him, making him look far older than he actually is, but have also made him infertile. Comstock recruits Rosalind to help him in the matter, but initially she refuses. At some point, however, she agrees to help Comstock obtain a child, as it would allow for her doppelganger, Robert Lutece, to enter this reality. The twins work together to make a device capable of not only opening a window to see into other realities, but to allow people and objects to pass through the tear and then open a portal to Robert's reality, where another version of Comstock had a child, obtaining Elizabeth. This version of Comstock, still calling himself Booker DeWitt, was initially compliant since the deal was his only way out of a massive gambling debt, but gets cold feet at the last moment, resulting in a botched transfer that leaves the child missing the tip of her pinky finger. Nonetheless, the child seems fine for the moment, and Comstock renames her to Elizabeth Comstock, seed of the prophet. All is going well as the public learns of the foreseen seed of the prophet, but Lady Comstock is far less than pleased, and she considers the child to be illegitimate and insists upon her living outside the Comstock household, resulting in the creation of Monument Island. This satisfies Lady Comstock for a moment, but eventually the whole charade becomes too much for her, and she threatens to tell the public the truth about Elizabeth and all the so-called prophecies, as well as everything else Comstock has been up to. Comstock has his wife killed and blames the assassination on one Daisy Fitzroy, a household servant at Comstock House. Fitzroy initially flees Comstock House and is able to form a resistance group to Comstock's world order, the Vox Populi, but is eventually captured by authorities. Fitzroy is incarcerated and later taken to Comstock House mental facility, where she is interviewed by one Dr. Pinchot for a time before her Vox comrades break her out of the asylum, just before she is scheduled to have a transorbital lumbotomy performed on her. Fitzroy leads the Vox and has been active since her breakout. However, she and the Vox weren't able to do any major actions against the Columbia establishment for the time being due to lack of resources. Despite the existence of an active terrorist cell somewhere in Finkton, Columbia prospers, acting as a roving World's Fair as intended, but it eventually goes rogue as news breaks out that the Boxer Rebellion in Peking has American hostages. The flying city veers off course and intervenes militarily, causing untold death and destruction in China before leaving. Outraged, the The United States government recalls Columbia back to American shores, but the city refuses, formally seceding from the Union in July 6, 1902. Since then, the floating city was very hard, if not impossible, to find, as Comstock likely didn't want outsider meddling while he and his founders further consolidated their power. Without the involvement of the US government anymore, Comstock now had complete control over the city of Columbia and further advanced his religious beliefs onto his people. While Columbia and Comstock were now safe from the so-called Sodom below, a new threat emerged. Elizabeth, Comstock's child from another world, was beginning to manifest spectacular powers as she grew. While it wasn't uncommon in Columbia to see tears, as the city was essentially built on top of Lutece fields, and some tears had even brought forth advancements in sciences and the arts based on what people could see or hear through them, Elizabeth's budding powers weren't just able to see through tears, but also able to open them and bring things through, possibly even creating realities where none had existed previously. The power seemed to only grow with her aging and her onset of puberty, and the effects grew more and more dangerous until Comstock was forced to close Monument Island to the public and secretly retrofit it with a massive siphon device in order to sap Elizabeth's growing powers before she inadvertently did something catastrophic. In order to ensure that no one went poking around Monument Island while Columbia's best and brightest studied Elizabeth in secret, Comstock commissioned Fink to create the Songbird, a massive mechanical beast to interact with Elizabeth and, more importantly, make sure she never got out of that tower in Monument Island. Songbird would go on to be one of the most feared entities in all of Columbia and a very popular children's toy. In another world, quite literally, Booker DeWitt chose not to take the baptism and instead signed a contract to work for the Pinkertons detective agency. His penchant for brutality makes him fit right in with strikebreaking and other things that the Pinkertons did around the late 19th century. At some point, he meets and eventually marries one Annabelle Watson from his own timeline, and they shortly have a child after marriage in 1893. However, Annabelle dies during the birth of the child, which sends Booker into a spiral of depression and vice, drinking excessively and gambling more than what he can afford to lose. Booker DeWitt amasses a large debt that the detective agency he was running at the time had no hopes of paying down. However, a man named Robert Lutece appears as if by magic and offers to pay off all of his debts for the price of giving his child, Anna DeWitt, over to his mysterious employer. Booker accepts at first, but when the time came for the deal to happen, he gets cold feet at the last minute and tries to wrest his daughter Anna from Robert Lutece's arms. Booker is unsuccessful though, nearly having his own daughter cut in half by the transdimensional portal and being left with only the tip of a pinky finger from his daughter. Again, overcome with grief, Booker DeWitt carves the initials A.D. into his right hand and again falls into a downward spiral of drinking and gambling. Again, a mysterious offer comes to him offering to wipe away the debt so long as he brings him the girl. However, this time, the girl is in the floating city of Columbia. While all seems to be going well for Comstock and his plans for prophetic domination, the Lutece twins are beginning to have second thoughts about their involvement in Columbia, particularly Robert. The twins see the destruction of New York City through the tears and realize that Comstock might be planning to take things too far if all things go according to his plan. Robert Lutece threatens to leave his sister if they do not undo which they have done, particularly Elizabeth and the interdimensional powers she got from the botched transfer. They plan to try and set things right by having the version of Booker DeWitt that initially gave up Elizabeth retrieve her and thus hopefully negate what they saw in the tears. Unfortunately for them, Comstock learns of their impending betrayal and has Fink send men to kill the twins. The assassins sabotage the Lutece device with the twins in it. However, rather than killing them, the incident scatters them across all time and space, effectively making them omniscient entities. While Rosalind is pleased with this new state of being, Robert still wants to set things right, and the two begin to orchestrate their original plan, using their newfound abilities. The Lutece twins appear before Booker DeWitt in the other timeline and take him to the Comstock reality to have him retrieve his daughter. Booker experiences a reaction similar to when Robert Lutece initially jumped worlds and begins to have hemorrhages whenever he is faced with information that contradicts his own reality, as his mind manufactures new memories to justify being in the wrong world. Booker begins to believe that he was given a job similar to the one he had previously had, where if he brings him the girls, his gambling debts will be erased. Once Booker becomes stable enough to function on his own, the Lutece twins bring him to a lighthouse where he is able to infiltrate Columbia. The task of kidnapping his own daughter and taking her back to the reality where she is originally from proves to be a difficult one. Based on the tally the twins are keeping at the carnival, it is implied that they have observed Booker fail at least 122 times. However, it is unclear if that means since the point of insertion, there have been 122 realities where Booker has died or otherwise did not successfully retrieve Elizabeth, or 122 different versions of Booker DeWitt DeWitt from an unbaptized timeline that have been brought back to the Comstock timeline and failed. It is also unclear if the player's deaths while controlling Booker will count towards this tally, or if certain events where Booker is incapacitated by Songbird or has a great fall count toward the failures. It is also unclear if the previous attempts were assisted by the Lutece twins or not. However, in the Events of BioShock Infinite, in which the player controls Booker DeWitt, the Lutece twins are clearly helping him achieve his goals. During the 123rd recorded attempt by the Lutece twins, Booker DeWitt infiltrates Columbia and proceeds to make his way through the city, currently participating in a fair and raffle event. He notices that there are public notices to look out for the mark of the false prophet, which just so happens to be identical to the mark on his own right hand. Booker is warned to keep a low profile and not to pick raffle number 77, but unfortunately is given that very number anyway and is discovered by local authorities. Being accused of being the false prophet destined to lead the Lamb of Columbia astray, Booker is forced to fight his way through Columbia's police force, learning that they are armed with vigors, tonics that grant whoever drinks them fantastical abilities, and in turn, he has to use the vigors himself to make it to Monument Island, the place where Elizabeth is being kept. Upon infiltration of the island, Booker learns that whoever this girl is, she is being heavily monitored by Columbia's scientific body, and that there is something very strange about this Lamb of Columbia. Listening to Left Behind voxophones reveal that, whatever it is, it's made Zachary Hale Comstock very sick with cancer, and that the best and brightest of Columbia have no idea how to keep the Lamb's energy contained in the long term. Booker eventually meets this Lamb of Columbia, Elizabeth Comstock, and learns that she has the ability to open tears into other realities without any sort of help. While Elizabeth is initially frightened by Booker, she agrees to come with him when DeWitt promises to take her to Paris. Unfortunately for the duo, Elizabeth's protector, the Songbird, attacks them, and Booker and Elizabeth only narrowly escape the Songbird for the time being. Booker and Elizabeth are forced to fight their way through the floating city of Columbia after a brief respite in Battleship Bay. Along the way, they're forced to detour to the Hall of Heroes, where Booker encounters his former military comrade, Cornelius Slate. Slate is leading a small insurrection of disgraced soldiers who are upset about Comstock's stolen valor. While Slate does not recognize Comstock to have once been the Booker DeWitt of this world, Comstock has clearly embellished his military rank while serving in the 7th Cavalry, and has ordered all memorabilia referencing Slate's heroism to be sequestered out of public view. After dealing with Slate through Booker's combat prowess and Elizabeth's ability to open tears to their benefit, Booker and Elizabeth commandeer the First Lady airship in order to escape Columbia. However, Elizabeth notices that Booker inserts coordinates to New York City rather than Paris, and she incapacitates him. However, with Booker unable to defend the duo, the terrorist organization, the Vox Populi, are able to hijack the airship, and Elizabeth is nearly apprehended by Columbia's police force. They also discover that they are now being pursued by handymen, mechanically augmented people that act as enforcers in Fink's business operations. While attempting to contact a gunsmith named Chen Lin, Jeremiah Fink attempts to recruit Booker DeWitt into his employment as a head of security. Booker and Elizabeth go to Fink's Good Time Club in order to try and rescue Chen Lin, but they find him dead in Fink's interrogation room. The Lutece twins appear before them and convince Elizabeth to open a tear into a new reality where Chen Lin is alive, marking the first deviation from the current set of timelines. While Chen Lin is alive in this new timeline, errors in this reality's continuity are leaving him and other people who have died previously strangely incapacitated. Booker and Elizabeth find their way through Shantytown, a ghetto where the poor and minorities of Columbia are forced to live, and raid the police station where Chen Lin's gunsmithing tools are kept. When they see that they have no way of transporting the heavy machinery, Elizabeth opens a tear into a second new reality in which not only is Chen Lin still alive at some point, but also have the tools necessary to arm the Vox. Unfortunately, it would seem that in this reality, which might at one point been one of the 122 previous attempts, Booker DeWitt abandoned his original mission, fell in with the Vox, and died a hero for them. Also, Chen Lin and his wife were killed at some point, but they did make the weapons for the Vox, resulting in a full-scale rebellion. After the initial shock of seeing someone who they had once thought was dead, the Vox label our Booker DeWitt an imposter, and now both Columbia's police forces and the Vox Populi are out to get him. Booker and Elizabeth fight their way through Columbia, which is now in a state of open war between the two factions. To make matters worse, the Songbird has their scent again, and they realize that it must be dealt with before they can leave Columbia. In an attempt to get to Comstock House where they might find the means to disable the Songbird, Booker and Elizabeth attempt to rob the grave of Lady Comstock, but are caught off guard when Comstock uses siphoned energy to reanimate the Lady Comstock into a quantum wraith of some sort. After initially dispatching her, the Lutece twins appear and urge urge the duo to follow Lady Comstock's remnants as it will lead them to a greater truth about the city. When they do, Booker and Elizabeth learn of Comstock's methods of systematically controlling the people of Columbia, and Lady Comstock was not only not Elizabeth's biological mother, but she threatened to expose the truth of Elizabeth's origins, and Comstock had her killed. Satisfied that the truth is now known, Lady Comstock's wraith opens the gates to Comstock House and allows Booker and Elizabeth to pass through. However, as they approach the gates of Comstock House, Songbird catches up to them and nearly kills Booker before Elizabeth agrees to go with her if Songbird spares him. Booker attempts to follow Elizabeth and Songbird, but a series of strange events leading up to the room where Elizabeth is being kept give him pause. Once he makes it to the room where she is being kept, Booker realizes that another Elizabeth, who has been fully indoctrinated by Comstock, has pulled him into a third alternate reality where the attack on New York City eventually takes place. After warning him of what will happen if Comstock is not stopped, this version of Elizabeth returns Booker to the previous reality in order to save Elizabeth and hopefully negate the existence of the timeline that Booker was pulled into. Booker manages to rescue Elizabeth and free her from the device that would have made her into an older version of herself that follows in Comstock's footsteps. Elizabeth is now convinced that they cannot leave Columbia unless Comstock is stopped once and for all. Booker and Elizabeth make their way through the rapidly deteriorating Columbia onto a sky barge that takes them to Comstock's personal airship, the Hand of the Prophet. Upon making it to Comstock's sanctuary, Booker and Elizabeth discover that Comstock had known about all the events leading up to their confrontation all along, and Comstock reveals that he knows of Booker's true origins before Booker kills him. Booker and Elizabeth realize that the only way to stop whatever Comstock has put into motion is to destroy the siphon holding all the energy that Elizabeth had once possessed. The airship is assaulted by a last-ditch effort from the remaining Vox Populi forces, but luckily, the duo learn the secret to controlling the Songbird, and they are able to fend off the Vox forces and make it to the siphon. When they reach Monument Island, Elizabeth has Songbird attack the siphon, unleashing a massive amount of energy. All the energy is returned to Elizabeth, who is elevated to the level of an interdimensional demigod from the massive amounts of quantum energy flowing through her. Upon Songbird returning to attack Booker, Elizabeth warps them all into an entirely different timeline where they are physically placed in Rapture, and Songbird will die of undersea pressure. Upon taking a bathysphere to the surface, Elizabeth's omniscience regarding the multiverse is revealed through an endless sea of lighthouses and doors, which represent all the choices and subsequent realities that these choices create. As they travel from lighthouse to lighthouse, they see alternate versions of themselves who have achieved a similar state. Upon realizing that there are an infinite number of realities where Comstock was able to elude the duo, Elizabeth uses her power to reveal Booker that his memories have been falsified from interdimensional traveling, and that all of this has been an attempt to correct the selling of Anna DeWitt to Comstock. When Booker suggests that they go to where Comstock was born and smother him in his crib to prevent all the realities of Columbia from ever happening, Elizabeth takes him back to the Riverside Revival, where she reveals to him that Zachary Hale Comstock and Booker DeWitt are in reality the same person, with Comstock being a version of Booker DeWitt that chose to accept the baptism at the river. Realizing that the only way to make sure Comstock never exists is to die before he makes a choice about the baptism, a number of Elizabeths appear before Booker and drown him in the river. As Booker dies, before the point that he could become Comstock, the Elizabeths disappear, signaling the negation of their own existence in addition to the negation of Comstock's existence and that of Columbia's, and thus, all the realities where Comstock and Columbia existed are paradoxed out of existence, and a new set of timelines where they never happened take place. This also effectively explains why no reference to Columbia ever existed in the Rapture timeline until the introduction of Burial at Sea. As a preface and a fair warning to all of you who might be rightfully confused about what happens in Burial at Sea's telling of events heavily retcons a lot of events from the first and second game, or at least they deliberately ignore events from these games in favor of a new way of telling the story leading up to the events of the Rapture Civil War. Now, it's one thing if, say, a secondary source of canon such as one of the novels is contradicted by Burial at Sea, but things will get a little weird when two sources of top-tier canon, say the first BioShock game and Burial at Sea, have directly conflicting events. I'm going to tell things here as they are presented in the Burial at Sea story, but whenever something in Burial at Sea contradicts another source, I'll put an asterisk in the top right and explain what is retconned. Now, for the sake of everyone's sanity, we're going to assume that Barry Litzy's telling of events is the correct version of things, as it is the most recent rendition of the BioShock timeline and gives off a vibe that this was series creators Ken Levine's baby and his intended send-off to the series. In an alternate timeline after the events of the baptism, one of the Comstocks renounces his new identity and asks the Lutece twins to take him to a reality where Anna DeWitt never existed after the transfer between him and an unbaptized Booker DeWitt goes horribly wrong, leaving Anna dead. Another version of Elizabeth is now tracking him down in order to make sure that no traces of the Booker stock exist anywhere in the multiverse. Elizabeth finds him in a reality where this Booker DeWitt has fled Rapture and allowed the effects of living in a new timeline to alter his memory. This Booker DeWitt has kept his unchristened name and now runs a popular detective agency in pre-downfall Rapture. Confused about the premise of this despite the endings of BioShock effectively erasing all of Booker, Comstock, Elizabeth, and Columbia? Well, a good way to think about this is that the Booker and Elizabeth of this BioShock game are sort of the equivalent of the Reverse Flash. For those of you that haven't read the popular comic Flashpoint or seen one of its many renditions, despite the Flash traveling back in time and altering the events that not only negate Barry Allen ever becoming the Flash, but in turn negates the existence of the Reverse Flash, however, the Reverse Flash continues to exist because he is also a time traveler and is presently existing outside of his given place in the timeline. And therefore, when the domino effect of Barry Allen negating the existence of his alter ego, the Flash, starts to take place in the timeline, the Reverse Flash is unaffected by this paradox because he's not in the path of these falling dominoes, so to speak. This version of Booker stock exists through similar logic. Because he wasn't in his proper timeline, in his proper place, when Elizabeth negated Columbia from ever happening, he is therefore unaffected by the paradox and continues to exist out of place in reality. The potential alternate explanation of Booker being alive as the result of a grandfather paradox doesn't really work here because BioShock Infinite's use of alternate realities, including ones being created through interdimensional tampering, makes the grandfather paradox impossible. When Elizabeth drowns Booker, rather than negating the event itself, it creates a new set of timelines where Comstock, Columbia, and Booker, living long enough to make a choice about his baptism, never happen. Clear as mud, right? Let's get back to plot events now. Elizabeth enters Rapture and begins to plan the removal of this stray Booker DeWitt. Before she can make a move on him though, she sees that Booker has taken in a young girl not unlike herself and the Anna who died during the dimensional transfer, named Sally. Sally, once a resident of Fontaine's little sister's orphanage, but when Andrew Ryan sees Fontaine's assets after the raid on Fontaine Fisheries, he shutters the orphanage, turning girls like Sally out onto the streets. It is implied, however, that Ryan et al. Quickly figured out the true purpose of the orphanage, as the Little Sisters Academy has already been created in its stead. Before anything can be decided about this though, Sally is kidnapped while Booker gambles at Surprise Casino in Fort Frolic. Elizabeth stops tailing Booker for the time being and begins to investigate the disappearance of Sally and other young girls just like her. Elizabeth infiltrates Sander Cohen's inner circle, becoming one of his disciples and even recording a few songs with him as Cohen's songbird, in order to deduce that Cohen is definitely involved in the trafficking of the girls who have been disappearing in Rapture at an alarming rate. After amassing enough information to be sure that Cohen is involved with the trafficking of young girls in Rapture, Elizabeth approaches Detective Booker DeWitt, telling him that Sally is alive despite what Security Chief Sullivan told him, and that if the two work together, they can save her. Elizabeth and Booker move through Rapture to infiltrate Sander Cohen's latest art piece, and upon entry, they confront Cohen about his involvement in the disappearances. Cohen agrees to take them to the girl, so long as they dance for him, as something recently happened to his previous muses. Booker and Elizabeth humor Cohen only to find themselves incapacitated and sent on a one-way bathysphere trip to the sunken Fontaine department store where Ryan has sent all criminals, political dissidents, and other troublemakers. The two learn that Sally has been transformed into a little sister and is presently collecting Adam off the bodies of dead splicers. The two hatch a plan to flush her out by overheating the vent system and closing off all but one access point to the pipeworks that the little sisters use to return Adam for processing. This works, but not without getting the attention of the Big Daddy assigned to protect Sally. After a prolonged fight against the Big Daddy, Booker incapacitates it, and the duo coax Sally out of the pipe. While doing this, Booker has flashbacks to his previous life in the Columbia timeline, where the accident with Anna DeWitt occurred. Elizabeth confronts him about his actions and refusing to accept his guilt shortly before the previously incapacitated Big Daddy gets back up and kills him. The Lutece twins are here too, but it's unclear if their involvement stems from seeing this as a part of their initial goals of clearing up their mistake, or if they just had nothing better to do after all the Columbias were successfully paradoxed out of existence. Elizabeth finds herself briefly in a Paris fantasy world that turns sour upon realizing that the Big Daddy has killed her too. She comes to realizing that the act of returning to the world that she was killed in has stripped her of her powers, save for a hallucination of Booker DeWitt that seems to know just enough to guide her to what she needs. She comes to discovering that she's been captured by Atlas and his men, who are planning to kill her out of mercy and take Sally for atom harvesting. Her hallucination of Booker tells her what to say in order to buy her some time to save Sally. Elizabeth is tasked with finding Dr. Yi Suchong, who has set up shop in the Fontaine department store. Suchong agrees to help her get what she needs to raise the department store out of the depths and back to Rapture proper, as long as he can fix a Lutece device that he built in his makeshift workshop that was recently sabotaged. Elizabeth finds the means to repair the device and finds herself transferred back into a version of Columbia from when she and Booker were fighting through the city. She discovers that Jeremiah Fink had been using tears to steal the secrets of Adam, and that vigors are actually just diluted plasmids that can be taken orally at the cost of needing 10 times the amount of Adam to do work. As a side note, it's never explained how Fink got that much Adam, or any Adam in the first place, as even using the intravenous method and Little Sisters, there wasn't enough to go around in Rapture, and a city placed right at the source of the Adam slugs, whereas Columbia was about as far away from them as you could get. It is also revealed that Fink and Suchong were collaborating on protector designs as Elizabeth discovers a framework for what appears to be an early version of the Big Daddy in his workshop. After acquiring the particles she needs to raise the department store back to Rapture, Suchong requests that Elizabeth find a genetic sample for him, which he believes to be the key for bonding the Big Daddies to the Little Sisters. Ironically, the sample turns out to be something Elizabeth had on her person the whole time, a lock of her own hair. When Elizabeth returns to Rapture, she is confronted by Andrew Ryan, who sends men after her. She escapes and makes it to the head office of the department store, where she can raise the building to the level of the rest of Rapture. After her work is done, Atlas betrays Elizabeth and instead tortures her, thinking that she has the secret to control his ace in the hole. While Elizabeth initially doesn't know what he's talking about, a series of visions during her torture reveal to her that the true secret to the bonding of the protectors to Little Sisters is to have the thing that they are protecting help them in some way, and that the passphrase is, "Would you kindly?" Upon revealing the passphrase to Atlas, he has Elizabeth killed but agrees to let Sally go. As she is dying, Elizabeth receives a vision of Jack from the first BioShock game coming and making everything in Rapture right, confirming the good ending of BioShock as canon. And there we have it, the entire continuity of BioShock as explained through all timelines. Now, I tried to be exhaustive as I could about all of this, but I understand that there's a potential that I missed something or did not fully explain something, but I'm sure all of you are going to light me up in the comments about whatever it was so that I can get it right when I inevitably have to redo this video when Cloud Chamber's BioShock sequel comes out, making new information present. Oh god, I thought this was going to be a short companion video to the BioShock speculation one, but holy crap, this is 42 pages long, making it my third longest video I've ever done, possibly my second longest, as I never formally typed the Star Citizen video, so I don't know how long that one is outside of my journal. I want to take the time to thank everyone over at patreon.com/charlatanwonder for helping me to make this video, and oh god, I thought this was going to be a quickie like the StarCraft timeline, but yeah, BioShock has a much more complicated storyline than an RTS whose novels have been confirmed to be retconned. I'd love to count you among my patrons if you're able to give right now, and rest assured that even the smallest amount goes a long way in making big videos like this one. In the meantime, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.